Welcome to delegates of the NGO-CSW65 virtual forum, and to any of you who may be following along elsewhere online. I'm honoured to have been asked to moderate this virtual forum on transfeminism and the women's movement. I'm honoured not least as a cisgender man, but it's not such a crazy decision from the organisers, as I will explain in just a moment. First, though, I'd like to let you know how we envisage this conversation going today. I'm going to start by introducing our four panelists, and then I'm going to ask them to go into a little bit more detail, each of them, on their areas of expertise, their background, and specifically the angle from which they approach this particular topic, the topic of how transfeminism fits into the wider field of feminism and how closely they're connected. We view that part taking between 5 and maybe 10 minutes, at which point I'll open the floor to the panelists for an open discussion session. And I will step in there only as needed to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak freely. Maybe that will be the end of the conversation, maybe not. I do have some pre-prepared questions for if things start to tail off, or if we want to change direction and broaden the conversation somewhat. We've got up to 90 minutes allocated today. However, we are looking to finish between 60 and 90 minutes. And so without further ado, my name is Alex Elliott. I am the project manager of RÚV English. RÚV is the national broadcasting company here in Iceland. And therefore, it's literally my job to facilitate conversations in English that are centered in Iceland and about Iceland to some degree, rather like this conversation today. Also, I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ plus community, and consider myself a feminist, as I believe everyone should in this day and age. But of course, feminism is an enormous field, and there are so many voices in it, each and every one of them coming at it from a very slightly different angle. And that is why this whole conference is taking place. And that is why this conversation this afternoon is taking place with four such very gifted, relevant and interesting panelists who I'm going to introduce now. First of all, we have Marion Berko, who is the founder and director of the Consultancy for Human Rights and Gender Issues in Berlin. She works as an independent consultant on an international, regional and local level for the implementation of human rights of individuals and groups, using interventions, campaigns and complaints under the UN human rights treaties and other human rights mechanisms. She provides expertise for civil society organizations, administration and politics of individuals, and serves as an expert on the implementation of gender budgeting. She has a focus on the UNSCR 1325, Women and Peace and Security, and offers capacity building training for human rights and peace activists. Her NGO affiliation, other than with the International Alliance of Women, is with UN Women Germany, the Women's Foundation, the German Women's Council, CEDAW, the Alliance of Germany, and the Alliance for the UNSCR 1325 in Germany. She served as a decision maker on several boards. As a feminist, she's committed to change in all areas, and she has a master's degree in modern history and mass communication, has published a number of articles and books, and before 2004 worked as a lecturer in politics and gender advisor on the board of the Green Party for the German umbrella organization on the rights of victims of human trafficking. Next, we have Mridul Wadhwa. Mridul Wadhwa is a manager of the Forth Valley Rape Crisis Centre in Scotland. She's the only trans woman of colour who leads the gender-based violence organisation in Scotland. She's worked in the violence against women sector since 2005 and has spent all of those years campaigning for better state responses for women with no recourse to public funds and survivors of forced marriage. She serves on the board of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, the YWCA, Young Women's Movement, and the Equality Network. Mridul is a trans woman and grew up in India. Next, we have Tatiana Latinovic, who is the president of the Icelandic Women's Rights Association. She's the first immigrant to be elected chair of the Icelandic Women's Rights Association since its founding way back in 1907. Tatjana has been a human rights activist focusing on feminist and immigrant issues ever since moving to Iceland in 1994. She's a founding member of WOMEN in Iceland, an NGO for immigrant women, which was founded in 2003, serving as chairwoman from 2004 to 2008, and a member of the board until 2012. She served on the board of the Women's Shelter from 2004 to 2012 as well. Tatjana is the chair of the Immigration Council at the Icelandic Ministry of Welfare, appointed by the Minister of Welfare in 2005, and has chaired that committee since 2017. She's been a member of Gender Equality Council at the Prime Ministry since 2017, and nominated by the Icelandic Women's Rights Association, the Federation of Icelandic Women's Societies, and the Feminist Association of Iceland. Tatjana works as Vice President of Intellectual Property at Östur, an international company in non-invasive orthopedics, which is headquartered in Reykjavik, Iceland. Ugla Stefanía Kristjánadóttir Jónsdóttir is our fourth and final panelist today. Ugla is an author and feminist campaigner with an MA in gender studies. They're a passionate advocate for trans rights and gender equality, and were part of a collective that pushed forward a recent legal change for trans and intersex people in Iceland. They partly reside in the UK, where they run the film project My Genderation, and they are the co-author of the Trans Teen Survival Guide and Trans Survival Workbook. As in the position of Executive Vice President of the International Alliance of Women, and was elected in November and nominated to that position of VP in December. I'm going to now go back to Marion Berko for a few more details about your own personal background and your approach to this topic. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation in general, and second, for the quite nice moderation and introduction. Yes, I think back in my first years when I was a student, and I have funded a women's and lesbian archives and research center in Münster, North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. There was one day, and I think we totally failed, a trans woman coming to our project and wanted to become a member as a feminist. And at first I said, I talked to her and I was not understanding much about trans, but when I heard she defined herself as a woman, I said, okay, then we talk about that and we will invite you, I'm sure, to our feminist group. And then I experienced that there was a lot of resistance and there was a lot of defining with a woman, etc. And then we failed, and this woman, I until today regret, was not invited, because we will later come into this definition issues. Many years later, when I was a consultant, there was a mother and her daughter coming to me in 2012, and she said that her daughter is a girl, or defines herself as a girl since she was 2 or 3 years old. They could see, they experienced that it was still her behavior when she was a schoolgirl, with 8, 9, 10, etc. Now the girl was 12 and then wanted to not become a man after her teenage time. So the problematic was more specific. The woman was, the mother was divorced, and the father didn't want that the little girl becomes or stays a girl. He insisted it is a boy because she was registered at her birth with the sex of a boy, of a male person. And now the father made a lot of trouble, and it had implications on everything in the life of this family. And the good thing was that her community was supporting the school, childcare before the school, the community, the neighborhood. Everybody supported the girl and had no problem, except in the kind of youth office case, they take away the health allowance to decide from the mother on the girl. And this was difficult because the girl needed to visit special doctors and wanted to consult for getting hormones and so on. So there was a clinic which actually wanted to lock in the girl as lying and having a complex dysfunction, as the WHO even decided for a long time ago. I hope it has changed now, that trans have a dysfunction, which is a health problem. And so this doctor wanted to take her in the Charité, which is a clinic in Berlin, very famous for a project. And we know that trans girls mostly get into conflict with the doctors, run away, and then have really problems. So I could help it with a huge solidarity action of trans organizations, and I've never known how much solidarity they can spend and create around a person in a case. And we made a lot of demonstration and political interventions. And 3 years later, everything was fine with the girl, and she could go on the way she wanted to go, and her mother was her. And this 3 years has, or 2.5 years, they have teach me a lot about the difficulties trans teenagers would experience, or the problems their families and communities can experience. And I hope it won't happen much more in this world again, because it is so simple if you see that they have the same human rights on self-determination and self-identification of the gender identity, and nobody can stop them or just lock them in for observation or whatever. So I think we can go into this more later, and I'm very supportive to trans women and also trans men and their movements for solidarity and mutual action.
Thank you very much for that. Mridul, move over to you now.
First of all, I have to apologize about my camera. I'm in a slightly different room and I don't know how to fix it. So you get to see my lovely sari. But so I have worked in, it's my bio said, I worked in the violence against women sector since 2005. And I started working in the sector, I would say, soon after migrating from India. And, you know, when I first got my job in the sector, I hadn't disclosed in my interview that I was a trans woman, but also I always thought, given my experiences of transphobia, that they probably wouldn't have hired me if they knew. But also it was irrelevant to the job, even though it was in the women's sector. I never questioned my right to be in that space. But at the interview, it didn't come up. And then within weeks, I realized there is no way that I can work within this women's movement without being an out trans woman, because the questions I was asked by my colleagues were about my childhood and, you know, all kinds of things about my womanhood. And I couldn't answer them without being honest about who I was. So I think within my second week, I said I was a trans woman, and I have ever since worked in the women's movement. But in recent years, there has been some questioning about not just my position as a woman working in the women's movement. And you might notice that I said I work for a gender-based violence charity. So my Rape Crisis Center, we work with all survivors who've experienced sexual violence, but a majority of our service users are women. We are staffed by women. And as Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom began to look at reforming gender recognition legislation, moving from what I see a very patriarchal process of getting a panel to approve whether you're a man or a woman, and so that you can then get a gender recognition certificate and then change your birth certificate, which is really a private document. You know, I've never had to show my birth certificate to anybody, ever, in fact. You know, I can't remember, even when I lived in India, having to show my birth certificate. And my birth certificate doesn't even have my name on it, because in India, they don't often name you till a few weeks or months after you're born. But anyway, so when that discussion began in Scotland, there has since been an unhealthy focus on women's spaces and who gets access to women's spaces and who are the women who should be working in those spaces. And it has been very divisive, not within the women's sector in Scotland, I have to say. So the benefit of the women's sector in Scotland is that, you know, it's the benefit of being a small country compared to the rest of the United Kingdom, which is England mostly, and Wales, I suppose, and Northern Ireland, but speaking mainly of England. But in Scotland, we had begun our work on trans inclusion, asking questions, preparing our staff teams, training, discussing, many years before GRA reform came up for discussion, and we have worked to a model of self-identification, which is what we want in terms of the law. We should be able to, as trans people, self-ID and change our paperwork, which we can for most of our documents except our birth certificate, without the intervention of a patriarchal institution such as a GRA panel for which you have to pay a fee. So we had begun to do this work, and we were pretty, as a movement, pretty strong in our belief that the spaces that we run, operate, are open and welcome to trans women, not just to access as service users, but also to work. However, politically, there has been some organizing from those who oppose trans rights. It started off as a good faith conversation. We have questions, we have concerns about this reform, but very quickly it has descended into what I see as the belief that trans women have no space in public life. And there are pockets of that movement who, in my view, are extremely genocidal in their view about where trans people can go and not go. Some of that has been targeted at me and the other trans people, but it has had some significant consequences within the political establishment, within the Scottish government, and we'll talk about that later if need be. So the legislation that was to be reformed has sort of been shelved to our next parliament, which is really only 6 weeks away. And there have been many introductions to different pieces of legislation that are transphobic in nature, especially looking at definitions of who is a woman and who isn't, and what is sex and what isn't, that sort of conversation. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now move on to Tatjana.
Yes, hi, very happy to be with you here. And as Alex mentioned in his introduction, I am a woman of foreign origin in Iceland, the country that has seen considerable increase in immigrant population only in recent 15 to 20 years. I've lived here for 26 years. That is not to say that Iceland has been a homogeneous country before, that everybody living here was of the same origin, worshipping or not worshipping same religion, having same sexuality, same values, etc. It's only that with the whole world opening up in last decades, the diversity has become more visible in Iceland and imminent, I would say. So Alex also mentioned that I'm one of the founding members of Women in Iceland, an immigrant association founded in 2003. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that, how immigrant women were allowed or have joined the Icelandic women's movement. So I'm very proud to say that now that 18 years later, since 2003, the Women in Iceland is an established and very active organization and a great voice for immigrant issues in the Icelandic society. It is not the first grassroots organization of immigrants, though. There were other before us that paved the path, but I believe that the decision that we made at the time when we were thinking about finding the organization and when we founded it, decision to make it a women's rights organization and join the women's movement in Iceland has made it sustainable to this very day. First of all, it helped us focus on our aims and goals, and while we were obviously wanted and were tackling immigrant issues and in general and furthering the acceptance of immigrant population in the society, at the core of our work were fighting for rights of immigrant women in all spheres of the society. And so fighting violence against immigrant women and exposing the vulnerability of their position was a huge focus of our work. And it is still today. I think that, for example, a good example of how accepted immigrant women are, but still facing a lot of problems, other different problems than Icelandic women, is that Iceland is the only country, I believe, where women of foreign origin organize themselves under a Me Too movement. the separate group. The other reason why this organization was a success is the fact that Icelandic women's rights movement, mainstream organizations active within it at the time have welcomed us very warmly. We did not have to fight to be accepted. We were just accepted. There was and still is a lot to be learned and done and changed on how to communicate and work on equal level, accepting women of foreign origin at the same level and as women born here. But this is a learning process, I believe. And I firmly believe that immigrant women not only get strength by being part of the feminist discourse in a country, but also strengthen and enrich the whole movement and cause. So we see it, for example, on when we talk about our fight for equal pay and gender pay, and if we do not make if you do not take and consider the intersectional approach of that matter, that origin also influences the way you're paid, we will never correct the bias there. It will just shift to other groups. So, and the fact that I'm speaking here today as a first woman of foreign origin, and I certainly hope not the last, president of Icelandic Women's Rights Organization, which is the oldest feminist NGO in Iceland. I think it's a nice, a great example to explain how we at Icelandic Women's Rights Organization look at the inclusivity. So I want to talk a little bit about that. As I said, back in 2003, then the then board of Icelandic Women's Rights Association and their management helped Women in Iceland organization then establish ourselves, just to taught us and helped us, and also gave us helpful points and tricks and advice, still letting us find our own voice. So we were a separate organization. And so a few years ago, women in Iceland have become a member of Icelandic Women's Rights Association, and cooperation continues to this day and hopefully for many years to come. So Icelandic Women's Rights Association, being founded in 1907, obviously has to change over time and has to make adjustments. Sometimes they sound minor, but mean a lot to people, new people coming in. For example, when you talk about women in Icelandic context, in Icelandic, we do not talk about Icelandic women. Ugla and Alex will know what I mean, but women in Iceland, because Icelandic women in Icelandic has the meaning of being born and bred in Iceland, but women in Iceland encompasses all women living in Iceland. So it's just a little thing that I think is very important. And so even such an established organization as Icelandic Women's Rights Association, in order to grow and keep relevant, it needs to reevaluate its mission and goals from time to time. And this is what we do. We try to do it, or we do it very democratically in conversation with our members. And we have had few sessions in last years where we looked at our mission statement and objectives, compared them to the current situation and discourse, and reached an agreement on our stance. And so, for example, when it comes to issues of gender, we have adopted our objective to say that we work on women's rights and the equal status of all genders in all areas of society. And we work on the basis of human rights and work against all kinds of discrimination. In order to achieve this objective, the association aims to actively participate in public discourse and focus on the following mission objectives, which have a clear feminist purpose and an expansive public relevance. So this, having a clear feminist purpose, is always at the core of what we do, with whom we work, and how we act. And so in order to do that, I believe that we must engage in conversations with others and be open to adapting in order to allow other diverse feminist voices that previously were not heard to be heard. I think as much as they owed it to the immigrant population, I think that we need to open for others as well. This is why I was talking so much about immigrants. And one of that means to do that is welcoming these voices into our association, our organization. So we have done it on issues of immigrant women, LGBTQ issues. What also helps in Iceland is it's a small society. So we, you can email or phone Ugla for, for a cup of coffee and discuss things, or myself, and we have been lucky enough to know each other, to be able to get to know each other quite easily. And so just like Women in Iceland, the Organization of Immigrant Women have become a member of our association a few years back. I was very happy to see that this year Trans Iceland has become a member as well. So I see that not just as recognition of their work, but also means to engage in a meaningful conversation on the side of feminism that we maybe in the mainstream don't have much insight in. And I think this is the way to go forward. And I truly believe that that at the core of feminism is inclusivity, not exclusivity. So as long as we are aiming and working towards the same goals, while we are learning, making mistakes or not making mistakes, everybody needs to adapt. I think that's the sort of, that is at least my motto while I'm working and doing that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much for that, Tatjana. Moving on now, last but by no means least, to Ugla.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this. I think it's a really, really important chat, and I'm always interested in having these conversations because I've been sort of, I guess both personally and academically, I've always been a feminist, and I've always been interested in feminist causes and making sure I am fighting from a feminist point of view. And this is why I went into an MA in gender studies, for example, because I wanted to make my personal experiences and my activism also academic, and I wanted to sort of broaden my horizons in that. So in Iceland, I think that's been quite interesting, because I think, when we compare it to, for example, like Mridul was saying, to the UK or to Scotland, Iceland hasn't had the same type of hostility, I think, towards trans issues as the UK. And for me, who currently lives in the UK, it's interesting to see the difference between, public discourse about trans feminism and about feminism in general and about inclusion. Because Iceland tells me that it doesn't have to be the way it is currently in England, mostly in the UK. So as someone who comes from that context, Iceland is a very small country as well. So I think we have the benefit of being able to be more personal in our conversations. We belong to the same communities. And I've been fortunate enough to work with many different feminist organizations as well as LGBT organizations in Iceland. So I worked for the for Stígamót in Iceland, which is the Sexual Violence Center of Iceland, and is known for their work in that sector. And I worked for them for a few years. So I've managed to sort of work in different areas. And then I worked for Trans Iceland for a long time. I've also worked for the National Queer Organization, which has done great work on LGBTQI equality. And I think for us, it's always been a matter of how these organizations can work together, rather than thinking of, oh, do they fit together? Because to us, it's always been obvious that, a feminist fight and the fight for LGBTQI equality is a fight that goes together, because we're fighting against the very same ideas, the same very oppressive systems, patriarchy, the gender binary, all of these things are contributing to that. And I think we as a society in Iceland and as a feminist movement have always sort of realized that, even though, there has of course been education needed to be done and people need to learn about these issues, in particular about trans issues, in the past 10 years, but there's always been the willingness to learn. And as Mridul said, there was, at the beginning of what's happening now in the UK, there was a really well-meaning, well-intentioned conversation that people wanted to have, but that quickly turned into something really hostile. And I think in Iceland, we managed to steer away from it becoming that hostile, and we managed to steer it towards a more positive direction. And I think that has been partly due to how small we are as well. We're, a small knit community. And essentially we all realize we all want to fight for the same things. We all want to fight for equality in its widest perspective. So I think that's been interesting in Iceland for me. And I've always been an outspoken feminist campaigner and trans activist in Iceland. That's always been, something that's intertwined for me. I can't take one apart from the other, because both of these connect in so many different ways. And we've done loads of work with the Women's Rights Association in Iceland, and we've done a few events and a few things together. So it's really great to see and be able to take part in in a movement that wants to be inclusive, even though there are problems and hiccups and things we need to discuss and stuff like that, you know, there's always the willingness to move forward and to make it as inclusive and open as possible, which is sort of a stark difference to the UK right now, where I see, you know, there are really prominent people who are feminist campaigners who go against trans rights, which is very confusing for me in many ways, because obviously to me it goes together. And I see this sort of infiltration almost into a women's movement that's supposed to be really progressive and is supposed to combat norm and is supposed to fight for everyone, is sort of being infiltrated by a really sort of conservative, sort of far right ideology about womanhood and what women are and what they can and cannot be. And it's really reductive, in my opinion, about womanhood and how we discuss equality. But I guess we can go into that a bit further later on. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
We can go into that a little bit later on. Almost immediately, I'm going to open up the conversation now to each of you. But that's a fantastic point that we might want to start on. Possibly Mridul might like to come in there, being based in the UK, Scotland specifically. I don't know. Would you like to speak?
Yes, why not? I mean, just reflecting on what Ugla was saying about what this conversation has become. I think it's, you know, Scotland is distinct from England, and although we're not as small as Iceland, we're small enough to have those personable conversations, and there has been a closer relationship between women's organizations and the LGBT organizations in Scotland. But the conversation has gone right-wing. So you hear from those who oppose trans inclusion or trans rights, condemning established women's organizations as being funded by the government, very sort of right-wing conspiracy theory, very Trumpian in that conversation. And that has really, unfortunately, dominated much of the feminist space for a long time. I would say that even during the pandemic, when we have had real issues with inequality, the transphobia has not stopped. In fact, it's sort of really stepped up and did not stop for us when we should have been coming together in solidarity. So let me speak more for Scotland, but I think what I said earlier, what we found initially was this really taking up of our time as service providers. I work in a service provision organization where we are working with survivors of sexual violence, and we struggle with poor funding. People are waiting ages before we can actually support them. And the campaign for those who oppose trans rights, mostly led by women, and the front face of it are women. And it's really fascinating to me that there are no men who seem to be part of this conversation at all, but they are benefiting the most from it, because obviously excluding trans people is to me is like the gateway drug to undermining other hard-won rights of women and LGBT communities. And we're already beginning to see that discourse seep through. So I'm just going to pause there, because I hope I'm staying on topic and let other people contribute.
Feel free, Marion, Tatjana.
Yes, if I might, I like to support Tatjana on the one hand approach of human rights. It's so simple, because you can't divide human rights. They are very much coming from the principle that it is an individual right. There's nothing about splitting human rights for the one group and the other one group. And I mean, so everyone has to accept that those who have been discriminated and coming forward and claiming their rights, and when they have their rights, as it is in many European or US legislation now, there might come some conflicts, debates for people who have not learned, understood, who have questions, but this should be in a respectful and then kind of civilized manner. And I think this works. And I really hope we are going to this basic of having educational means, that having dialogues, asking questions, getting answers, and then try to understand or have kind of consensus, to find consensus. Because I heard there are lots of very simple frameworks of abolitionists who are coming from ending or banning prostitution and sex work. And now the same circles are coming with this banning, canceling gender identity, that gender identity, and really in heart, I would say even very fascist or right-wing words, framing gender identity is erasing women or sex. And then I was wondering from where it is coming, but they can't give information. It is kind of a fake news campaign. Like in social media came back to our real circles of feminists, and there are also debates which are risky to split organizations. And I had yesterday a conversation with a friend from the European context, and she said that in UK there is a debate that trans are taking it all. And then I understood not really what it was, but then we went into facts, and I understood that there are some trans persons, and it is always generalized. Huh? We shouldn't do that. But some are claiming that no woman ever can have a woman's space because all trans must enter this space. And it's a discrimination if these women who define themselves as non-trans women would say this is our space, it's not for trans women. So there's a battle on, okay, give us all space and other issues. So I asked myself if they perceive that gender identity has some conflicts, why don't we sit down and tackle and find out if there's not an option in this case to respect that some women want to have their space, then they should label it like it's the all woman, traditional woman, non-trans space, whatever. I can even, it's sometimes a private issue. I can meet with whom I want. I can define myself as, in my circles of friends, as what I want. But I know there are some legal means if it comes to whatever, if it is a public space or an organization. But I didn't understand why it is canceling sex, because all the legal means or the laws in Europe, like in Spain or Portugal, in Germany, in UK, where I checked, there is still the category of sex. So the one argument that there's no more statistics which covers women, and it is all cancelled and erased. It's not true, because this is the ideological moment. So I think we have to discover dismantle the ideological moments, but then discover what is the remaining practical issue in daily life and how we can find consensus of this. But instead of canceling gender identity, which this movement is bringing forward, I think why not framing like, okay, then when it happens that sex is cancelled, let's keeping sex and gender as it is in the United Nations defined. And I don't see it is cancelled yet, sex, but I think a positive move could bring us together, like keeping on with sex and gender. And for example, I worked with intersex persons, and for them it is very even important that there's the category of sex. And I know that there's some argumentation that all what you define upon your gender is in your head, and there's nothing by biology. But this is an opinion, and okay, it can have a place for me. I have no problem with this if people are thinking this, but other people who claim that biology is very important, why forbidding them to talk about it? And I don't see reality about cancelling sex or people who insist of the category of sex and the biological gender. For me, there is also something else. We need to sit to each other to talk and have dialogue, because this creates empathy. And as I learned for the human rights community, empathy sometimes from our history or her story is something which is only for our own tribe, our own community. And then if it becomes in a wider circle and you don't know these people, you can't sometimes develop empathy, like for your sister, for your brother, for your next person around you. And so the same, like I think there's an interlinkage with racism. We need to create this awareness that everybody, even how far away, how unknown is a human being. And this division between these people and these people, even here in this discussion, creates just borders which we have to break down by creating empathy. But this is only possible if I know a person who is trans, if I know a person who is Black, if I know a person and who tells me directly what are the problems and experiences of discrimination, then I can develop empathy. But nevertheless, information, I think, is the most important issue, to spread information, but also create spaces where we can meet and perceive this on a very personal way. And then I think as more the laws have been created coherent with human rights of trans persons or interpersons and lesbian, gay, and all kinds of people, as more these, in this case, trans persons or trans women will reach out to women's organizations, women's workplaces, like you both described, Mridul or Ugla, and you want to work there as a woman. And sure, we have to open up, I think, but as far there are problems, these companies, workspaces, organizations must probably have the time to discuss this. Because traditional, I was also asked what is about the international women's movement, from where the women's movement comes. I think my organization has not visibly had a trans woman in our membership or in positions, I would say. And I wonder if this is not because of the traditional discrimination, that if they had been trans, they have never opened up. We have a huge Indian section. We have members from all over the world. So there must be trans women, but I guess there was no space created to be open about that. And so I think we have to discuss this, but in our actual program of International Alliance of Women, definitely we are deeply rooted in women's and human rights. So there's no space to leave these agreed positions. And even if we leave it, the human rights will be there. They are natural, they are given. Nobody can just cancel a part of it.
Very interesting points there about attempting to define gender and about the concept of cancelling sex outright, and also empathy. Anyone want to pick up on those points?
Yeah, I think, the idea of these discussions, which Ms. Marion was talking about, like that something is somehow being cancelled or thought it doesn't exist and something is being erased, is all based in very explosive and no evidence ideas. It's all zero-sum debates about something that actually isn't happening, really. There's almost like there's been a problem manufactured in order to keep that conversation going. So, when they talk about that, women's organizations are being taken down and they can't do the work and, all these things, women's organizations across the UK have been, for example, have been quite trans-inclusive for many years, and many service providers are trans-inclusive. And in Iceland, that certainly is the case as well. So when they talk that these places are somehow being inundated or there is a huge problem within these organizations, these problems aren't happening there. And, as Mridul was saying, there's a lot of generalization around these issues, and someone sees one trans person do something and all of a sudden that is all trans people everywhere. And we just know that this doesn't work. And we know this with different groups, with people of color, immigrants, there's always taken an example of something bad that might have happened that someone did that might be an immigrant, and all of a sudden all immigrants are bad. And this is happening with trans people in the UK a lot. There's maybe a trans person that's done something and all of a sudden that's all trans people, or all of a sudden all trans people are violent, or all of a sudden all trans people are this. So there is a really sort of explosive, I think, argument being had that's really being encouraged and facilitated in the media in the UK. And I think the media plays a big part in sort of platforming this discussion and making it seem bigger than it actually is. Because I think the women's movement and the feminist movement isn't as divided as it might seem if you just listen to the news and you just hear the news stories. Because I think the media in the UK in particular likes argument and likes conflict. So they facilitate that increasingly around trans issues in the past few years, I think. So anything that's dramatic or can create some sort of a conflict, the media will grab it and will use it. And there's often no balance to it at all. And there isn't any sort of journalistic standard to checking, well, is there actually anything behind this? Is there any evidence behind claims that are being had? And usually when you dive into it and when you really look into it, there isn't really any evidence of these things happening. And they're always sort of, you know, cherry picked from somewhere or something that might have happened. And it's never really substantial evidence of things happening. And, you know, if we look at research and if we look at human rights and we look at institutions worldwide, trans people are recognized, and there's, you know, loads of statistics and research that shows that trans people are very vulnerable when it comes down to violence and hate crimes, and in particular from men as well. So, you know, it just seems so incredibly strange to me that these people aren't focusing on the common grounds that we have, and we aren't focusing our energies on issues that actually matter. You know, there's loads of groups in the UK that have raised loads of money, thousands and thousands of pounds, to fight against trans equality, when there are women's centres and rape crisis centres in the UK that really, really need funding and really, really need money. And these places are the places that can actually help women and can actually make a change. But these groups are unwilling to do it because they also want to help trans women. And it just goes to show how poisonous this can be, because it's halting equality for all of us. It's making us have a fight which we don't have to have, and it's taking us back by, you know, we're facing so much time and energy based on something that isn't an actual issue, instead of continuing forward and finding ways to work together. And I think that's the biggest issue, that a lot of these debates don't have anything behind them, and there isn't any sort of substantial evidence or substantial ideas of what's actually going on. And I think the sooner we can sort of reveal what's behind all of these arguments, the better. And the problem is that these arguments are often shown as very reasonable. And they're shown as something that makes sense. And, you know, someone's just being concerned, or they sort of dress them up in fancy wording or these things, and they don't say what's actually behind what they're saying. And this is true for a lot of influential figures. For example, J.K. Rowling has been criticized a lot for what she said about trans people, and most people don't realize what lies behind what she's saying, because if you just listen to what she says, she might sound quite reasonable, but underneath that is something a lot more sinister and a lot more insidious that people don't realize. And I think the sooner that we can start to sort of wrap those layers off and tell what this is really about, people can start to realize and think, oh, actually, this isn't based on our foundation of equality and human rights and where we want to go as a movement. But I don't know how to do that. But I think, you know, the more conversations we have about that, the better.
Yeah, the concept of using a broad brush to paint a very narrow picture of a vulnerable minority group is a fascinating one, and it brings up questions about how motivated, how focused this opposition is. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that point. Tatjana.
I'm not familiar with it. I just wanted to say that, again, to reiterate what I said before, that fighting for human rights for a certain group or something, you know, you will not achieve your human rights if you're excluding others. And just not accepting trans women in the feminist movement will not make them disappear, will not further your human rights. I don't see how my position will be better if I exclude a trans woman or migrant woman. So I think that, and I will let Ugla and Mridul speak to you, to other stuff. But I always try to understand where people are coming from, you know, and without maybe knowing the agenda, or if there is a, I don't know, commercial or political gain for something that like populists are working on. But I could imagine that there is this element of fear for your own rights, because it comes also from nationalism and other. And I've come from a country that has this polarization. A lot of polarization has been going on. So you're always sort of afraid of your own rights, which actually you do not have if you have to fight so much for them. That you think that someone else coming into discussion will sort of endanger them. So I think that this paradigm shift in thinking, I think that by enabling others, I don't know if enabling is a good word. I mean, but just opening up to others is and empathizing, having empathy for their fight, their need to be recognized and visible will not will only improve your well-being, I think, at the bottom of that. So and regarding we haven't had any of these discussions on trans rights, and Ugla, correct me if I'm wrong, and Alex, in Iceland, in Icelandic media. I see it a lot when it comes to immigrants, like what Ugla was saying, but somehow, we don't have, and maybe this is because, Ugla has done such a great job in being representing the population and going out there and explaining that. So I think that we have been quite lucky, at least on that front in Iceland. Not that our media is perfect, but it's not as polarized and as sort of mean as in some other countries.
Can I add? And I think just to reflect on what Tatjana and Ugla said, and also Marion, I think there is a lot of unhealthy media space given to trans stories in the UK media. Almost all of it is negative. And if they are positive stories, they're so rare. But the negative stories, they have been incessant. In fact, it's a really interesting way of dividing society because it has, to some extent, pushed out the sort of anti-immigration stories that exist in the UK media. They still exist, but it's like we're fighting for space. And for those of us who work within intersectional communities, you can totally see how this devotion to transphobia is, to me, is like the gateway drug to attacking all our human rights and all the rights that we have. What is, and I see the UK, particularly the Westminster government, as it's a very imperialist fascist government. They're very imperialist in their ambitions. And if I look back to what happened in South Asia, which is where I grew up, and who was criminalized and marginalized first when imperialism was taking root, were trans people. And I just can't help making those comparisons. But when it comes to organized women's spaces, there is the Equality Act that offers protection to trans women and trans people. It also allows, within the reason, but very specific, legitimate reason, to exclude trans women from women's spaces. That is what the Equality Act allows. Now, personally, I cannot imagine a situation, having worked in the women's sector, where we would want to use that piece of legislation to exclude trans women. But it is there for those who wish to use it. But also it is rooted in this idea that, and the pressures that trans women face in women's spaces to be cis-like we must appear as cisgendered as any of you, and whatever that means. And I find that deeply problematic, because that's where that, for me, that's where that law has come from, that when you pass as us, but that also reduces womanhood and the expression of womanhood to a certain type of femininity, which we are all fighting against. But that's where this conversation has now centered. So while, like Marion said, it's important for women's organizations to have these discussions with empathy with each other, I would say that in Scotland, we have done that. And for those who've come with more questions, we have sat around the table with them with as much empathy as we can. However, we've reached a position where we do not want to do that anymore in Scotland, because those who are asking those questions now do not have good faith. To me, as Ugla said, it's hard to expose some of them. You know, if you look at their careers, have dedicated a lot of their time and space and energy to promoting women's rights. But as a woman of color, as an immigrant, I would also say that those women have dedicated themselves to the cause of white supremacy, because the only women that they have made space for are white women, because where is the position of migrant women in countries like Scotland? And those are the women who, interestingly, are those who oppose trans rights, but then use their historic contribution to furthering women's rights. But they only furthered the rights of white women, to some extent, maybe disabled women, but largely white, cis-abled women, for them to get a seat on the table. And once they were on the table, that's it. That's enough for me. And so, you know, like, I totally see the sort of white supremacist nature of this transphobia and how dangerous it is. And I also see that as service providers, we have created those spaces for women, for trans women, for migrant women, but we have a long way to go, but we need to have those conversations. But if your starting conversation is, I don't believe that you can be a woman, I believe that, you know, when you're talking specifically about sex, like, I accept, you know, I grew up in India where female feticide is a real issue. I was never at risk of being aborted in the womb, but yeah, cis women were, and their experience of inequality was more palpable. More people were conspiring and are conspiring against cis women. But I was thinking about somebody who said, well, you grew up in a male society, but compare my experience as a trans woman. I went to an all-boys Catholic school. Now, if you are in a space where you're the only woman in a male space, what is that experience like when you've suddenly found yourself there and no one wanted you? Well, that is the trans experience. So of course, my stories of inequality are different, but they intersect with the inequalities that cis women experience. And I think, like, we've been trying to explain this as trans women for a really long time, and we continue to do so, but those who oppose our inclusion are not interested in this conversation. So they're, you know, and when they're not interested in the conversation, they weaponize survivors of sexual violence, as they are doing in my case in Scotland, where I work within the rape crisis movement, as they have done in specific pieces of legislation. They're weaponizing, and what that does is that those who have questions, those who have not interacted with trans people, who haven't interacted with diversity, as some of us have the privilege to, will stay away from our spaces because they're genuinely scared. And that is on those who oppose trans rights. They are undermining the rights of women and the safety that all of us around this table of this Zoom room, have fought to create. And I'm going to pause there.
Maybe I come into this now. As a Jewish woman, you know, I had immediately in the middle of this debate, where it was worse in one setting, the idea that why the abolitionist women, feminists, calling themselves even progressive feminists, radical feminists, are coming from the approach of being against sex work, ending sex work. That's fine, absolutely fine. And they always insist that they want to ensure the human rights of sex workers, now with an issue which is almost striking against trans women. And they say, no, we are not against trans women. And I heard in France, the red line is trans women can, no, yeah, I mean, what I call trans women can enter women's organizations, networks, spaces, when they call themselves women, not trans. So ask why can't they, self-define themselves, because sometimes it's politically important to say from where you are coming. You might explain it better. But what is the word trans then so dangerous? And when they are saying I'm a woman, then it's okay. So they see also the conflict which they are getting into with the human rights. But the problem what I saw is they connect sex work generalized with all trans women. So also there's something like trans women are never becoming women, they are still men. So it's the patriarchat which is in our house, which enters all our spaces. And what they are doing, and as a Jewish woman, I think, is they're reaching out for a small group in our society, a minority, which is easily to be attacked, generalized as something bad with some suspicion. And that is what we call scapegoat theory, or scapegoating a group. And I ask myself, which power is reaching out for this? Are these really progressive, radical feminists? Maybe you said they are reaching out for personal, being disappointed somewhere, being powerless to attention in media who grab this, and networks, and hopefully not money, think tanks, bots, and there are some. And you said white supremacy. Yes, there's something in Eastern Europe being against all this by other reasons, by religious reasons. And I heard a lot, it is called disinformation campaigns on gender and gender identity, not only gender identity, also against the Istanbul Convention and other issues. But in general, everything which is coming with gender is battled by the anti-gender movement as kind of killing the family. So it's very similar to erasing women. And in Eastern Europe, there are big networks of Putin and disinformation campaigns, whether in social media, but also in traditional media and in real spaces. So some people are influenced by this, I would say. And the other thing is the right-wing white supremacy in Western, European, and US and other countries. So in these cultures, it's really deep-rooted. And if you if you scapegoat a little group, you can come with your whole racism, your whole fascism. And to summarize, it's something to destabilize the whole national policies, the whole bilateral, like UN networks, international community. Because if feminism has grown and has getting more space, more power, I think, in the last years, even as a very weak response to the right wing. So democratic politicians and groups had to decide, is feminism something we can include? Are there voters? Are these women voters important for us Democrats? Or we exclude them and then we have less votes. So there's a simple power question about that. And so they have included us, and I think in the UN we have so much more to say, or power, even it is limited and we want more. But to split us over such an issue, it doesn't give a damn on trans women's rights and feelings, but it is on a big power game, a global power game. And this makes me fear, because first of all is the risk of you trans women getting attacked in more or earlier or later. I'm sorry to say that, but it's my feeling, in a very real way, not only in social media. And I know human rights defenders are attacked on the street, and there are lots of experience like that. And also the second is our feminist networks will be target of this, but also the democratic networks, the UN and etc. Everything connected to human rights. So who calls herself a feminist or himself a feminist should think about what kind of track he or she is following, because I think maybe they can reframe their argumentation, but they have to recognize where it is rooted. And this is really nothing which should become bigger. And it's frightening me, even for our movement.
I mean, I agree. I think that, this idea that feminist spaces are now, and feminist discussion is being made unsafe for groups of people, really speaks volume about how sinister it's become. Because, you know, as a feminist campaigner and as a trans activist, I'm afraid now to enter certain spaces that I otherwise wouldn't have been afraid, and that's because of this anti-trans discussion. And we can see that in research in the UK about violence against trans people. You know, it's increased in the past 5 years exponentially. And that's partly due to this really anti-trans discussion that's being had, that these people are actively participating in. So they're actively participating in making society more hostile for a vulnerable group of people. And once that becomes the issue, then you really have to stop yourself and think, why am I contributing to this discussion? What is it actually achieving? Because all it's achieving is more inequality in society. This discussion that we've been having in the UK, I think, for the past 5 years has not achieved anything positive. Not a single positive thing has come from this discussion in the UK. Not a single positive thing comes from these debates. And all it does is it halters the rights of trans people and of LGBT people and other rights in general, because we're always so focused on something that's a non-issue. And I think the comparison which Mridul and Tatjana and Marion have been making between different groups is a really powerful tool to get people to realize how bad it is. And, you know, it's so easy to make those comparisons, because I can even make comparisons to things like marriage equality. You know, when people were fighting for marriage equality, there were voices who were saying, oh, you're taking away our rights of having marriage, and you know, marriage is no longer for us. It's being, you know, it's being widened to something that isn't for us. And they felt like, you know, queer people were attacking marriage, and they were attacking the what it is to join into marriage. And anybody can see now today, I think anybody who isn't completely homophobic can see today that, of course, these arguments are nonsense. Like, just because more people can marry, it doesn't mean that anyone's rights is being taken away. It means that more people are able to access something. But, you know, marriage is an institution which is criticized for various reasons. But it's, you know, the same arguments are always being used for different groups. And the UK has a bad history of how it's treated LGBT people, with laws such as Section 28, which banned to talk about LGBT people in schools until 2003. So, you know, the UK seems to be repeating its history, and now trans people seem to be the target. And you can almost take headlines from the 90s and the 80s in the UK that have gay in it, and you can replace it with trans today, and it's the exact same argument, it's the exact same tactics, and it's the exact same thing happening again and again. And it's really, really, you know, chilling to see that these arguments are exactly the same, and we can't recognize that. And those people, even people who fought against this at the time, are now using arguments which were used against them only a few decades ago. So it's really, really shocking, I think, to see. And I think we need to start getting people to realize this, and we need to point these things out and be like, this isn't right, like this isn't acceptable. And we need to realize that we can't continue down this road, because there is nothing positive that's going to come from it whatsoever.
Maybe just, I don't want to stop here, because we have now framed and interpreted, and with all our knowledge from where it is and the consequences. But these risky consequences we can only encounter by just spinning more solidarity around trans women. As for my organization, we have a new program, a new president and chapter of time before us, and we wanted to be more inclusive, more intersectional working. So that means also to see which groups are at risk and include and build solidarity and safety around them, and arguing and doing everything against the opposite. And I think this is also in this fight a big, I would say, weapon. I'm a pacifist, I shouldn't say, but it's a big mechanism to go against this destabilization powers, because the solidarity has brought us here in the CSW, whatever, today in our big movements, and we shouldn't give up this, we should strengthen this. And there are lots of positive ways to go from here.
Yeah, I would just like to add, exactly. I think this is a sort of a test on the feminist movement and feminist organizations. because it is perpetuating the same as Ugla said, it's the same discourse and same words that were used for LGBT people, for immigrant people. Mridul says that, yeah, even if they want to accept you as a trans woman, you have to look feminine, who am I to, it's just postmodernist age, people can look the way they want to look. So it's educating people and also not expecting everyone to behave and to look like you. And also when I talk about empathy, I think that, the minority group does not have to show empathy for the big group necessarily, I think it has to be the other way around. And then the discourse needs to start. It needs to be on the same level. And I am very excited. That's what I said with the beginning. For the Icelandic Women's Organization, we want to stay relevant. I think that, especially for the younger generations as well, I want to believe that they think differently, and that because of the way the world is, it's not just, everything is not black and white. We have to sort of get out somehow of this patriarchal, hierarchical thinking that unfortunately I think many people fall into, without really, perhaps without realizing it themselves. So that's why I think that, like discussion like this, it's great. And I'm sorry to hear, and I don't know, I know how bad the situation in the UK is, that if you have had the discussions and you have sat with people at the table and they don't want to discuss this, maybe, it's not their place to discuss feminism anymore. I think we need to, replace them with someone else who is willing and courageous enough to engage in that conversation. Sometimes just, people have to move on. Sorry for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. It might be a time to start thinking about wrapping this conversation up now. If anyone has any urgent last points they'd like to add, please do. But it's been a fascinating conversation, I must say. And for me personally, some of the points I've taken from it is the concept of all of feminism being the antithesis of the sort of the patriarchy, the status quo, the forces of big conservatism, and that the interests that are served by splitting that up into smaller groups, this divide and conquer thing. For me, at least, that was one of the key parts of this conversation. And converse to that, the stronger together argument, and the fact that giving more people more rights doesn't take away your rights. I think that's a huge one as well, as is the comparison to so many other movements. Racism, LGBTQ rights in general, marriage equality, they are all more linked than you might immediately think. So I guess that just leaves me to thank the panelists. Marion Berko, wonderful to talk to you. Mridul, Wadhwa, Ugla, Stefanía, Kristjana Jónsdóttir, and Tatiana Latinovic. And I would also like to thank Brynhildur Heiðar Ómarsdóttir, from the Icelandic Women's Rights Association, for facilitating the conversation and being active behind the scenes and making it all work. I hope it's been an interesting and constructive conversation for those of you, of the delegates listening, and it will be available, a recording afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Bye.